They're not even claiming to be monotheists yet. All Abraham knows is this God wants me to follow him. He's expecting loyalty. But does Abraham understand monotheism this way that we do yet? My answer is no, not at all. And I don't think his ancestors do either. In fact, if you read it, the whole point of Genesis through 2 Kings is that the people never really followed true monotheism. And that's why the fall happened, the destruction of Babylon, is because they never really gave the Lord their full loyalty.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast. I am Keegan Walls, your layman, here with the man, the myth, the legend still pending, Dr. Mark Chavalas. How are we?
I'm doing fine right now. Somebody commented on your hat. I figured I would try to one-up you and certainly not show my face, because that's the whole point of being incognito. This is not a Boston hat. This is a Brooklyn hat, since I bleed Dodger blue. So anyway, now I'm done with it.
That if you guys want to know age-wise, that's Mark's hat from when he was a kid. So Brooklyn Dodgers. That's getting pretty old. No, we're joking. I did promise our viewer I'll take off the hat eventually. Pulled it up a little bit so you can see my eyes. So today we are gonna finally get back to the Bible. So you excited? We're done with our aliens?
Yes, I am. But I do have to spend a few seconds clearing off a very nasty rumor about Keegan. Rumor has it that he lives in the basement down here. I don't think it's true. My 2-year-old grandson was here the other day, and he was knocking on the basement door and asked his mother, and she asked him, "Why are you banging on the door?" And he says, "Keegan, we want Keegan to come up and play with us." And she informed him, no, he doesn't live down there. However, I was gone for about a week, and while I was gone, there were some significant changes made in the studio down here, and I suspect that Keegan does come down here and live here occasionally. So I can't really quell the humor.
No, I wait until night, and then I sneak in through the window well.
Well, actually, sometimes we had children that liked to sneak out the window well in the old days. But anyway.
Good kids.
Yes.
Well, very cool. So yeah, we're excited to get back into the Bible. We are going to be diving back into Genesis, and we're going to be looking at Genesis 15. We want to look at the covenant between God and Abraham. We want to talk about something that there's not that much context to, or there's not that much commentary on, which is the specifics of this covenant we see between God and Abraham, where there's the smoking pot, there is the flaming torch. It's dark, it's scary, there's all this mystery, there's all this intrigue, and if you just gloss over it, it's nothing. But if you actually spend time a little bit looking at it, it's this really random and weird and mysterious text. And so we want to focus on that because Mark's actually been, for a while. How long have you been working? You've been studying this and working on some kind of article?
I was invited to contribute an article to a book, and they approached me in February. So this has been percolating in my mind since February. So that's, we're in July right now. So there's about 6 months worth of percolating.
So yeah. So Mark's been studying this quite a bit extensively for quite a while now. And so, yeah, we want to talk about that. But before we do that, we do need to look at Abraham himself, the life of Abraham. And there's some preparatory work to understand what's going on in Genesis 15. And so today's episode is kind of setting up the framework, the context behind that before we dive into that mystery. And so we're going to look at who Abram even was, this man that unknown, and he's from a pagan family, has no idea who God is, and God decides that this is the man that I'm going to make a great nation with. And so we need to dive into him, his story, his life, maybe talk about why God chooses this one man to basically create relationship and build his covenant people with. And so I'll turn it over to the scholar himself, and let's dive into the life of Abraham.
Oh, great. The one theological question you asked that I can't answer, why did he choose Abraham or Abram at the point? I have no idea. In fact, that's the whole point, is it appears to us to be completely and entirely random. But
We'll save that for the end.
yes, okay. Oh, so I can tell you I don't know at the end also. That's great. So I know I talked a little bit about Abraham during our first couple podcasts, the first couple episodes, but that was a while back. And funny thing is, not everybody looks at every podcast, I found out. And so repetition probably is going to be useful here. And so to provide a context for Genesis 15, and by the way, the weird stuff doesn't begin in verse 17. How about the animal parts and the darkness and the dread and all this other weird stuff in Abraham's deep sleep? By the way, I'm just going to call him Abraham, although he hasn't technically had his name changed yet. I'm going to anticipate it since you'll always know who it is. So, and by the way, if you're looking at this in terms of context, we just had the Tower of Babel happen, and I do have a plan to talk about Babel at some point. And so, in other words, we're going out of order, at least in terms of the order of the text, although the text isn't necessarily always in chronological order. I think Genesis 10 happens after Genesis 11 in terms of the table of nations being described. That sort of can't happen until after the disbursement of the nations, which happens at Babel in Genesis 11. But anyway, and so you've just been hearing or reading this text, and Babel has just happened. The nations are now, or the people are now being dispersed. Of course, it's a judgment on humans once again. And then what's the first thing that God decides to do after we now have some genealogical history? God now decides to choose a person that, of course, anyone reading this in antiquity already knows, the basics of the story. This is our ancestor. Most cultures, even today in the Middle East, they'll try to recognize a named ancestor that they can all identify with. And in many respects, this is a good thing. If you and I can recognize that we have a common ancestor, for you and I, it might be really, really way back, maybe it's Adam. But the point is that if we recognize that, then we can recognize a kinship. And so I remember living in a town in Syria, and in one of the small villages, they pretty much recognized that everyone was descended from someone who had lived about a century and a half earlier. And so they basically called everyone was their cousin one way or another. And of course, that just provides a kinship. They knew family connections, family narrative, etc. Oh yeah, that's so-and-so. He's my mother's cousin's, brother or whatever it is. That doesn't make any sense, but you can understand what's going on here. And so here, the Israelites were not that different. They would always hearken back to a particular ancestor. All of them would hearken back to Abraham, who of course is not just the ancestor of the Israelites, but of many other different peoples, which the Bible talks about. And then of course, you get to 2 generations after him with Jacob. They recognize that each of them would be come from one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And that also became very important. Which son was it? Which wife was it? Was it one of the servant wives? Was it one of the main wives? That would also decide whether or not your particular tribe had status, higher status or lower status. And we might get into that at some point, depending on how this goes after Nibiru. So I thought we'd start by just looking at a couple of verses at the end of Genesis 11. This is where the writer's describing genealogies. And by the way, the genealogies in the Bible, if I can say this sort of as a teaser, they're not meant to be comprehensive or exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. So if you use genealogies to try to create a very precise scenario for chronology, I'm thinking you're gonna run up a I don't know how to make this up. You're barking up the wrong tree. It's not going to work, and it's going to cause all sorts of issues that you're going to forcibly try to reconstruct history based upon your interpretive model that's going to have a lot of faults to it. So genealogies in the ancient world and even in the modern world are never meant to be exhaustive. They're usually specific. You think about it in the New Testament when the genealogy from Adam all the way to Jesus, Adam to Noah 14, Noah to Abraham 14, Abraham to David 14. Does that mean there's nothing in between? How amazing. And then from David to Christ, I think it was 14 if I'm not mistaken. But the point is there's something going on here. 2 times 7. Does that mean there's nobody in between? Probably not. And so and even ancient commentators understood the tension there. So here we have this genealogy.
First side note, I'm sorry, this is my ADD.
Yes.
Is this kind of why Paul is talking about, like, don't get into these debates and scuffles over useless genealogies, or is that something different?
That's probably something different, but I think the principle is not terribly different in the sense that, if I think that, in other words, I'm not going to base my observation of your Christian walk based upon whether or not you've got your genealogical system correct. Okay.
All right, back to the story.
And he probably doesn't, by the way, but I don't know. We haven't
not.
discussed a lot of genealogy lately. And I tell you the story, I think I did in one of the earlier podcasts with one of my workers who didn't know the date he was born. And I thought I could impress him by telling him the date and the time and all that. 5:31 in the morning, I was born, on this such a date. And he says, well, how many fathers do you have? And he could rattle off 30 generations of ancestors, and I could rattle off 3. And so I realized at that point he had a much better handle on his family past than I did. So anyway, genealogies, we begin in chapter 11, verse 27, the generations of Terah. And of course, everyone listening to this knows, oh yeah, that's the father of Abraham. I'm going to call him Abraham here. And then it says Terah fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Why do we have to be told about all 3 sons? Because they all play a role, 2 of them relatively minor in this, but they're there. Does the fact that Abraham mentioned, does that mean he's the firstborn son? Not necessarily. He's the most important one, so he's mentioned here. And this is Haran fathered Lot. Why do we need to know that? Because Lot plays a major role, in the story in a couple of chapters. First as a passive object in chapter 14, and then, of course, in chapter 19. Well, you know what happened there, Sodom and Gomorrah. And then we have to be told in verse 28, Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And that's where we're going to stop for a second. In the 19th century, when the city of Ur was uncovered, that sort of changed things. Before that, commentators assumed that Ur must have been a northern city somewhere in Upper Mesopotamia where the family homeland was. And so the fact that we have this editorial statement, and by the way, they found a couple of towns called Ura in Eblatex and other places that could be potential fits to where Ur was, except that everyone knows in antiquity that the big and important city called Ur was the one in the south and southern Mesopotamia. And the editorial statement here tells us that the Chaldean Ur, there's no argument as to where the Chaldean Ur is. That's the southern Ur that was famously excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 20s and early 30s. And so he mapped it out. Super important Sumero-Akkadian city, thousands and thousands of cuneiform texts from 3rd millennium through Old Babylonian, all the way down to, by the way, the Hellenistic period. So this is a city that has a very, very long shelf life. The term Chaldean, by the way, is quite late. And so Perhaps when we talk about authorship later on, I can address that. But certainly an editor, a divinely inspired editor, by the way, in my opinion, is attaching that to make sure you understand this is where Abraham comes from. And there is a little bit of tension, I think, even in the Christian world in the 19th century. Wait a minute, how could Abraham be from down there when all his family seems to be up here? Where is he going? The writer isn't particularly concerned to tell you about the geographic route, but he's from Ur of the Chaldeans. Clearly, in my opinion, this is southern Mesopotamia. What is Abraham doing down there? Is the question. And then let's move on. Maybe verse 31. Terah took Abram his son. Let's just call him Abraham again. And Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. And then it talks about Terah, how long he lived, etc. Then we have chapter 12, which, by the way, there probably is a good argument for not making a chapter division at this point, because this is all preparatory for the big story, and that's, of course, the call of Abraham at this point. So it's been giving you a little bit of genealogical information. And, oh, by the way, we're also told that Sarai was barren. Why do we need to know that? Because that's going to, of course, factor in a couple chapters later. And if you're reading this or listening to this, it doesn't take a long time to go from chapter 12 to, let's say, chapter 16. Even if it's a slow reading, it's probably 15, 20 minutes. And so you're getting a lot of information at this point. So in verse 12, now the Lord said to Abram, by the way, this is the divine name calling Abram out of the blue, go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land I will show you. By the way, when you read this, there's no, later biblical commentators will argue that God's calling him while he's at Ur. But if you read this in sequence, it looks as if he might already be in Haran. So he's one place or another. And so it says, go forth from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. And that's all he's being told. And, commentators have made the point, and I think it's a very good one, is that when God calls out to Abraham at this point, he doesn't stop him and say, by the way, buddy, there's only one God, and that's me, and you're a pagan, and you've been doing all this bad stuff. You need to stop what you're doing and follow me. There's none of that theological statement. God basically starts off by saying, go to a country that I will show you, and I'm going to make a great deal for you. I'm going to make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. You'll be a blessing. Think about what he says. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse you. And all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, of course, this becomes really, think about it, one of the fountainheads, one of the core datum points of the great monotheistic faiths. Judeo-Christianity, and of course Islam later on, but we're not going into all that right now. The point is, this is the centerpiece of all that. But if you think of Abram at this point, if he is a southern Mesopotamian, he wouldn't be opposed to following a particular deity that wants to make a deal with him. And by the way, it looks as if there's no string attached, except that he has to go somewhere. And where's he going? Well, to the land I show you. Okay, that's pretty immaterial. And verse 4, Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Or it sort of looks as if he got the revelation while he was in Haran. I'm not going to argue with this, because the tradition is that he was still in Ur. And that's also, I think, even the biblical tradition later on. So you look at Joshua 24:2, when it talks about Abram and his family being pagans. coming from Ur the Chaldeans. And so maybe that's just a summary statement, and maybe I'm just quibbling over details. By the way, there is a connection between Ur and Haran. And Abram and his name, by the way, which means probably originally friend and then becomes father of a multitude. We have the same personal name in Ebla texts from around the mid third millennium BC. And they're clearly a Northwest Semitic type people group, writing in Akkadian, by the way, but their primary language is something that would be, you might call Proto-Canaanite. The people group that Abraham is probably involved with, they're probably Amorites, by the way, which is really funny because, of course, they get such a bad press in the Bible, and they're even ripped on in Genesis 15. But he's probably a Mesopotamian through and through, and we do need know a little bit about the city of Ur and its connection with the moon god, Suen, in Akkadian, sometimes called Sin when you contract the vowels, or Nana in Sumerian. And most cities had mayoral deities. The only other place that I know of that had the moon god as its mayoral deity was Haran, up in Upper Mesopotamia, which was probably centered, one of the centers of the homeland of the Amorites. And at least in terms of linguistically speaking, Abraham was probably an Amorite connected to this people group. We now know that the Amorites, Sumerian phrase Martu and Amuru in Akkadian, it might mean something like Westerner, except that in the earliest text, the Amorites don't appear to be necessarily specifically connected to the West. We have Amorites over in Elam, over what would be present-day Persia. We have Amorites sort of all over the place. And so maybe it's kind of like the term American, depending on the period and the context, you really don't know exactly what you're, spatially what you're talking about until until you're provided a context in a paragraph or whatever, or the time period that we're talking about. And so, so if he is an Amorite, we do know that there are, at least in later Mesopotamian texts, Amorites do appear to be centered in inland Syria up in the north and up into what would be present-day Turkey. A really nice article, by the way, on the Amorites was written by Dan Fleming in this book that I might have mentioned this before, The World Around the Old Testament. And Dan Fleming writes the first article on the Amorites. It's probably the most authoritative, quick summary of the Amorites, about 30 pages worth by, there's probably nobody in the world that would know more about the Amorites, especially an English-speaking world, than Dan Fleming. Really, really good guy, personally and academically. And wouldn't you know it, it's been about 2 or 3 years now that the Amorites, and again, I'm theorizing that Abraham is probably connected to this people group. The Amorites did end up coming into southern Mesopotamia, probably in a slow percolating way in late third millennium. And then by the old Babylonian period, they seem to be dominating the scene, although they take on the Sumero-Akkadian culture. And so you have Amorites who are adopting Sumerian and Akkadian traditions and the language. And so they're writing in Akkadian. They did not write in their own language, as far as we can tell, which would be a close relative to Akkadian. In fact, in many respects, Amorite looks like something that would be Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Hebrew. And wouldn't you know it, just a couple of years ago, we found, or in fact, let me just read a little bit of this. This is only from 3 years ago in the Revue Assyriologique, which I'm sure all you subscribe to, the French Assyriological Journal. This is volume 116 in 2022, and so it goes back a little ways, by the way. Andrew George and Manfred Krebenik wrote an article, Two Remarkable Vocabularies, Amorite / Akkadian Bilinguals. So though we have no text in Amorite. We found now a sort of a couple of bilingual texts that are describing, in other words, they'll have an Amorite word or phrase and the Akkadian parallel to it to help somebody understand how to work with the two languages. It's the first of its kind. It's been sitting, for example, the article says a first edition of two cuneiform tablets inscribed with unusual text. One is in the Jonathan and Jeanette Rosen Cuneiform Collection, where it bears the number CUNES 50-11-020, number 1. I know that's going to mean a lot to you, but the point is that it was found in a library or a cuneiform connection, and the person who was the curator of us, David Owen, was kindly allowed them to work with this material. There's another tablet that they found. And to get to this really, really weird point, yesterday on my phone, I'm sure you all get this. I get news articles about things happening in the ancient Near East, which sounds really exciting. And I got an announcement about the newest edition of the Journal of Northwest Semitic Languages, volume 51, which I'm sure you probably all subscribe to also. And I went down a little bit, and Hugo A.T. Ross has written an article reevaluating the Amorite verb, expressions of tense, mood, and aspect in the prefix conjugation. Now, that sounds like a keeper, by the way, especially if you're into grammar. But the point is how could you write an article on Amorite unless we're beginning to learn more and more about it? It's kind of cool, by the way. But anyway, my theory is Abraham is an Amorite. They had been thoroughly enculturated with Ur, and so I'm trying to figure out when would he have been at Ur? I don't know. By the way, Hammurabi himself, the great lawgiver, is ethnically an Amorite, and the genealogy that we have for him goes back to Amorite connections. And the Assyrian king list up in the north also has Amorite connections to it. I'll maybe explain that at some point. And so he's probably part of this tradition. I suppose to be like any particular people group coming into the U.S. Let's say you're an Italian American. Well, you had to be an Italian first. And so if you're an Italian American and your family has been here for 2, 3, 4 generations, you're probably well aware of the fact that, oh yeah, mom and dad, their parents came from Sicily. And we know they came on the boat in 1908. Personally, being of Greek heritage, I can track my grandfather's coming here in the early 20th century. And so I recognize that I have that tradition, except I'm pretty thoroughly Americanized by the time you get to me. And so I'm guessing Abraham was pretty thoroughly Mesopotamianized at this point, but he's going back to his family homeland. I don't know whether he's called at Ur or whether he's called at Haran, but God's calling him to come into a land that he'll show him. Well, it sounds like a great deal. And of course, this is just a summary of the issue. And so if you're Abraham at this point, you're thinking, you've got probably a million questions like, God, that's really cool. You're living in New York City and you want me to go to Iowa. And it's like, would you like to tell me anything else? No, just start moving. I'll let you know when to stop. I've got a great deal for you. And Abraham seems to be in agreement with this, although what does he know about this? Well, I'm going to be made into a great nation. It seems like God is giving him information in increments, kind of like how he works with us. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't map your whole life out, Keegan. Just start walking. And, and euphemistically, I think it's pretty much how God, operates with us. And so this is really a good pattern for us. And of course, Abraham makes some stupid mistakes, just like we do. Oh, that's sort of comforting, I suppose, if you're a weak human like we are. So
let me stop you there then.
Yeah.
So I know you brought up the moon goddess, but
God. He's a boy.
Oh, there we go. Whew,
Yeah.
Don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So the moon god, what else? Abraham being an Amorite, what's his worldview, or who are the main deities he's worshiping? Just for my head, like, what's his background? Obviously, he's still a polytheist at this point, being called by God, but like, what's his, and it doesn't have to, obviously, we're not going to be an exhaustive context of Abraham, but
Good.
overall, like, what's his worldview, deity, theistic worldview?
Well, I'm going to start off by telling you just a note or two about what the rabbis would have thought of this, because they have that tension too, to think, and I think I've told you this before. In the rabbinical tradition, every question must have some sort of an answer. So, in other words, I should be able to give you some answer, even if I make it up. But by making it up, I'm theorizing like this is a logical possibility as to what would happen. So, for example, in the Apocalypse of Abraham, which is one of the pseudepigraphal texts that I talked about when we talked about 1 Enoch, um, the Apocalypse of Abraham is basically an interesting background story. I believe it's fictional, by the way, but it's a reasonable fiction as to what was Abraham's life like before his calling. So in this story, Abraham's dad is an idol maker. By the way, this is later rabbinical tradition. Well, it's actually not quite rabbinical yet. It's a little bit earlier than that. But the point is, but it is definitely a Jewish tradition, which is trying to provide a scenario of what was Abraham's life like. So Abraham's dad is an idol maker. That it can't exactly be true. If you're an idol maker, you're actually in the priesthood, and it's a very specialized craft. Not anybody can just start making idols. There's got to be all sorts of purification rituals and all this. But Abraham's dad is an idol maker. Abraham is called by about things, and he's making the intellectual observation. Hey, Dad, so you made this God, and now we're going to be worshiping it. That doesn't seem to make sense, Dad. And of course, Dad's like, just be quiet and continue on. And so it's a really interesting. It tells me a lot about what's happening in the just before the Christian era, is what people are thinking. And this is also done even in rabbinical sources, where it talks about the fact that, his dad was an idol worshiper. And again, it continues on saying pretty much the same thing. Abraham is now primed for God to call him. But if you really think about it, the biblical text doesn't tell you anything like that. And what would he be worshiping? Well, he's a polytheist. He's worshiping any and all gods. And I know I brought this up before, but it's a good place to repeat this. If you're a polytheist, you recognize that polytheism has a multiplicity of powers. And when you add up all the powers together, it's still not the sum total of the power of the universe. There's something beyond it. The Israelites, in their revelation, believed it was a personal divine being who was above all of this material, above all of the corporal, world in existence, and was personal. For them, there was something beyond this, but it was impersonal, and they couldn't describe it. But matter was what was eternal. The gods were there, and you could sort of tap in to the correct one. I make the silly statement that if let's secularize it for a minute and talk about our town. If today's trash day, by the way, in my neighborhood. So if I go outside in the afternoon and the trash wasn't picked up, I'm thinking, what's going on here? The trash isn't picked up. So I get down and I call City Hall. And I said, hey, give me the mayor. So what's your problem? Well, my trash wasn't picked up. They're probably going to tell me that's not the mayor. He doesn't come and pick the trash up. Well, I didn't think he picks it up, but doesn't he organize that? No, that's somebody else. Well, get me them. In other words, I have to go to the correct source if I want to find out whether or not, what do I need to do with a discarded tire or whatever it is. I need to call the right part of the city. And so if you have a particular problem in town or with a particular issue, you have to call up the correct deity. And so you might worship the moon god for mayoral issues, but there may be another deity for a particular sickness, and you might not know it. So you might have to go to a particular religious technician who will first ask you for some money, and then they'll let you know, oh, by the way, that particular sickness comes with this particular deity. And by the way, you're also going to need an exorcism, and that's going to be a little bit more money. I'm being a little cynical here. Maybe it's because I'm a monotheist, but it's uh, you're just going to hope for the best, by the way. And so Abraham is worshiping a multiplicity of deities. And so it probably wouldn't be an utter shock if a deity called him and told him his name, by the way, because I'll put it this way. I'm assuming that God told him his name. The narrator tells it's the Lord. And so I'm going to guess Abraham probably asking you, what's your name? Who are you? And he probably would have told him. And he said, I'm not familiar with you, but there's a lot of other gods in the pantheon that I don't know either. But I mean, there's a multiplicity of deities. It's not singular. And of course, even at this point, there's nothing about the Lord that is describing his exclusivity to Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to bank on that for a while, because you think about it. Think about people who come to a belief in Christ from a pagan tradition, let's say overseas somewhere in the third world, whether it could be India or Borneo or Laos or wherever it might be, and they can't understand the full theological ramifications of now following this God, no more than Naaman could in 2 Kings 5, when he decides that because of the miracle that he saw, that the God of Israel was the true God. Did he understand the exclusivity of that yet? Probably not. But the point there was believing loyalty. And so at this point, all Abraham knows is this God wants me to follow him. He's expecting loyalty. Just the following is, and of course that loyalty is going to come out a little bit further in Genesis 15 at that point. But does Abraham understand monotheism this way that we do yet? My answer is no, not at all. And I don't think his ancestors do either, for quite a while. In fact, if you read it, the whole point of Genesis through 2 Kings is that the people never really followed true monotheism. And that's why the fall happened, the destruction of Babylon, is because they never really gave the Lord their full loyalty. And now at the beginning, maybe it's an intellectual issue. And does this ruffle a few feathers? I understand that it might. And again, I'm making my educated guesses to try to figure all this out. So anyway.
Yeah, so I'll stop you there, because I just have a couple other, and maybe I'm theorizing here a bit. But that makes sense, because God isn't saying here's the rules, here are the covenant requirements, here's the traditions, and I know this isn't Old Testament terminology, but like sacraments, rules. Oh, and yeah, by the way, I'm the only one. He doesn't give him any rule set or anything like that. He just calls him. My question would be, so based on that, first off, I would say to our listeners, I think we get through Abraham's life without kind of reflecting and understanding the beauty of it, of what's happening and what has been happening in the Bible, that God makes a people. He creates the cosmos for relationship with us, to come and dwell amongst us. And we see that in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. We ruin it. And now all this time passes, and there is no, at least from what we get from the text, there is nobody with Yahweh and his people. There's no more connection, which is why God's calling him seemingly randomly, right? They're worshiping all these other deities.
Right. And is there nobody? We don't know. Of course, that's the whole point of Genesis 14, because all of a sudden Abraham is having relations with Melchizedek, who clearly he's a Yahweh. You look at the text, it looks like he's a Yahweh worshiper. So it's not as if he's the only one, but God is calling Abraham out for a very particular purpose. Doesn't mean it doesn't mean there's no one who's following him. It just means that we're unaware of that until I think of when Genesis 6, it talks about the fact that people called upon the name of Yahweh. They understood his power. Where does that line go? We're not told. It's not. Right. It's not there's not an answer to it.
So it's the creation of the nation itself. But
yes.
But again, seeing that beauty of it's the start of that restoring of relationship amongst the people on the earth and the one true God. And so we're finally getting that back. What was broken with the fall in Genesis, now God's going to establish his people to regain relationship. And eventually, what we're going to see down the road is this building of the temple for him to come and dwell with man once again
Yes.
on earth. But right before this, which I know we're not getting crazy into the weeds of Babel, because we're going to do probably a whole series on that. Is there a connection with what we see God promise Abraham in what they were attempting to do at the Tower of Babel, which is they're trying to essentially, not to give away everything, like not really reach God, but almost like an elevator to bring God down, building this tower for God to come and dwell because it's going to be beneficial to them. Well, if we can learn his ways and we can do what he wants, then he'll bless us. But they're trying to kind of circumvent God, because when God sees it and comes down, he doesn't like it at all, and he puts a kibosh to it.
Yes.
So is this like we had just seen that type of using God as a means to their end and benefit, but now what we see God do to Abraham is, no, I'm going to do it myself to be the blessing for you. You not using me as like a conduit to ultimately give you what you want, which is what we see a lot even in American Christianity. I'm using Jesus as a vehicle to actually bring me to what I want, which isn't him. What he wants is he wants to be solely worshiped. So are we seeing, at least in your estimate, is there parallels to God's taking control of that blessing? I'm going to bless you, but we're going to do it on my terms. And so Abraham's kind of like, well, I mean, that's what we want. Yeah, that sounds like a good deal to me.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a lot more going on with the Babel story, but I think that's one of the issues, is that people clearly are trying to be independent from God. And you're right. In fact, you think about it, much of Mesopotamia, that the whole point of the gods aren't there for my benefit. And so I have to be able to figure out the wisdom behind the gods and how to have the gods benefit me, for my purposes. And it's through divination. It's through, all sorts of other uses, making deals with them, etc. And so, this really, so that fits quite well. So from this standpoint here, you're right. Here's God now. Think about it. This is God making the first move.
Yeah.
With somebody who's minding goes, and what is Abraham doing? I wouldn't be surprised to find out that Abraham was a Mesopotamian priest. I don't have any evidence for it. What I'm saying is that I could see him as a professional, really, really high up, but again, I'm just musing right now, but I don't have any evidence for that. But the point is that he probably is somebody that is renowned. That's my guess. And so it makes it even more interesting that he just decides to drop this. I recently saw a made-for-TV movie on Abraham and a sacrifice of Isaac, and they did a really good job trying to muse about Abram and his wife, and he was a priest of the moon god, and he gets this calling, and he's trying to wrestle with his wife, figuring what's going on here. This God wants me to do such and such, and I'm thinking that's actually pretty good. I mean, it provides a nice context, as long as you're not taking it as literally as the point for point, because you think anybody who would have gone through this would have some sort of mental stress and reservation, like what's going on here? Why does he want me to do that? I mean, really think about it. If God called you today, I want you to leave here and go 3,000 miles west to do well, I'll let you know when you get there what it is that I want you to do. It's like, okay, that's there's not a lot to go on, God. And of course, you think about what Abraham does as we move on. He makes some pretty stupid mistakes. He tries to pawn his wife off to Pharaoh in Genesis 13. Not a good thing, by the way. And of course, if you're Sarah, she's probably angry at him for the rest of his life. And why is he doing it? Well, I'm going to have descendants, and well, you're barren. I remember we were told that already. If you forgot, she's barren, so she's obviously not going to be the one that the promise is going to go through.
But yeah, my side note would be, that as an application to people who are listening to that, like, we just think, "Oh, Abraham goes, yeah, because it's just simply a good deal." But it's like, is that not kind of the main drawback of what we see of, well, yeah, I went to church and stuff, but I'm afraid if I give my life to Christ, then he's gonna call me to go be a missionary in Africa. And we're afraid that God's gonna interrupt our life and call us to do something we don't want. And essentially, that's what we're seeing here, at least a partial seed of faithfulness of Abraham even answering the call. Yes, it's a good deal to him. He's polytheist, polytheist, and God is calling him to do something. But God's interrupting his plan and his world and saying, "I'll show you the way as we go."
Yeah, and that thing about not doing things that you don't want to do is like, isn't that our flesh to begin with? It's like the whole point of Christianity is denying your flesh, and so, and well, that's another thing. I'm getting theological again. All right.
Well, no, that's cool. So that sorry about that little bunny trail. I was just curious on that. So I'll let you jump back into the background.
Well, I want to go to Genesis 13 for a minute because, well, maybe a little bit more about background. We know that the Amorite homeland is, like I said before, in inland Syria, up near the great mountain called Jebel Bishri. In Akkadian texts, they're mentioned both by Akkadian kings, later Akkadian kings, and also the Ur-3 monarchs are talking about the Martu. They even built a wall to block them from coming in. And this is probably the family homeland that is called in the Bible Aram Naharaim, which, by the way, is also a later editorial statement. And even in Egyptian texts in this period, we have the term Naharaim without the Aram part. And so they recognized this northern region, and this is probably the Amorite homeland. And so even though Abraham's living at Ur the Chaldees, his family homeland is up in the north, kind of like, I suppose, if you ask my kids, where are you from? And they, well, we're all born and raised in Wisconsin, but I know that, mom and dad met out in California. So I guess we got California roots, and they would recognize that. And then even more so, the Greek root, et cetera. All right. Now, in Genesis 13, when's the next time you think about it? God now talks to Abraham again in Genesis 13. Does this mean that he wasn't talking to him in between? Not necessarily, except that the writer is emphasizing certain times that God talks to Abraham. And so it's almost like a reminder. This is after Abraham and Lot decide to part ways. And so here we are in Genesis 13, verse 14. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. And I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. This is really beautiful hyperbole. Arise, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I'll give it to you. So Abraham moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. I think he had built an altar also in chapter 12. He built an altar in chapter 12 also. Other than that, we don't have his personal response, like, hey, this is a really cool deal, or anything like that. It's interesting. The writer is sort of withholding Abraham's response. Then you get to chapter 14, and we're going to do a separate one on this too at some point. This is the story of Abraham using an entire army to rescue Lot from the kings. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail about it, but it sounds like a historical military narrative, and it's very typical. That doesn't prove its historicity, by the way. That's another issue that we can talk about. But the point is, it's sort of a different type of narrative, and what's it for? In many respects, this narrative is now going to set the stage for what happens in chapter 15. Abraham goes off with it says 318 of his retainers, I guess, are they his regular, employees? I don't know. It depends on what you think the words mean there, but he goes off and he defeats these kings. And then at the end of that story, we'll probably even do a separate one just on his meeting with Melchizedek, which is a really strange and odd situation, and this is what I want to bring up at this point. What happens at the very end of chapter 14 is, again, preparatory for 15. There's an order to the order of the Bible. There's reasons for it, and so we have to try and figure it out. Why is 14 randomly there, and what happens at the end of 14 that sort of segues into 15? So, Abraham is blessed by Melchizedek. By the way, I think Melchizedek is an earthly person who blesses him. He becomes a prototype for something cosmic, but he himself is not cosmic. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I know that's going to upset a few people here and there, but I don't know what to say. But
he's an archetype.
He's an archetype, and it's interesting. So after, let's stick to verse 21. Verse 22. Abraham has relations with him, and then he has relations with the king of Sodom, by the way, at this point. Then verse 22, but Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to Yahweh. So he already knows who the God is. God Most High, El Elyon, possessor of heaven and earth. So it sounds like his theology is coming a little more crystallized at this point. That I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. So you think about it. He's just made an oath to Yahweh at this point, not to take. And by the way, the sandal thread or whatever that sounds like a later Assyrianism that we'll talk about it at some point. So it's not. It's just the fact that he brought that up again is not accidental. It's a figure of speech, we're guessing. And I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me and let. So in other words, this all has meaning probably for future Israel also, is that, our ancestor did not do such and such when he came into this land. I'm not going to deal with exactly what that is at this point, but it is now preparatory for the third meeting that God has with Abraham, which is in chapter 15. And it doesn't start off very well, by the way, if you think about it. So let's decide what we want to do, whether we want to continue on with 15, at the beginning, we could probably start off with 15 as a teaser at this point.
Yeah, I would just say maybe start out with 15, and what for people who are listening, getting ready for the smoking pot and flaming torch. What's the significance, or what's the main takeaway I have to understand that's prepping me to be able to rightly understand what we're about to see in 15? Beyond everything you already said.
Abraham, in a sense, that anecdotal piece of information at the end of 14 is anticipating the fact that Abraham is proving himself as worthy to God at this point. And of course, we know all the famous verse in chapter 15, verse 6, which I'm not going to elaborate on because it's so theological, is Abraham had believed in the Lord and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, which Paul uses, in multiple occasions in his letters, and I think the writer of Hebrews does too. But the point is that it's preparatory. Abraham's made an oath, and so he's definitely putting his lot in with the Lord at this point, even though he hasn't received. Well, think about it. He probably hasn't received anything yet, and the time that it involved from chapter 12 to chapter 15. I don't know how much time it is, but it's a lot longer than you listening to it, which is just a few minutes. Does he fully understand his monotheism yet? Probably not. And there's all sorts of weird things going on in 15 that clearly do not look like accepted Jewish practices, certainly not under the Mosaic covenant. Okay. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why I think Genesis is so authentic, is that if I were the editor of Genesis, I would have said, a a lot of this weird stuff that is happening is makes me uncomfortable. Let's sort of monothe- monotheize it, if I want to make up a word. In other words, let's not have those teraphim anymore. They're going off and making all these, they're making these altars in places that they shouldn't be making altars, etc. In other words, it's all pre-Mosaic, and they're basically wandering around doing their best to understand their relationship with this God, and perhaps not fully understanding the fact that even when Jacob makes a covenant with Laban, Laban makes an oath to multiple gods, and Jacob makes an oath to the fear of Isaac. In other words, the one that my father has followed. And so his whole family, they're not even claiming to be monotheists yet at this point. So this is definitely a work in progress.
Which is what God does with us, right?
I hope so.
When you first get saved, I always joked, I'm like, well, God doesn't convict me of all sin and open my eyes to everything that I need to work on. He takes little areas, and it's this progressive journey. So at least in the New Testament covenant of Christians, it's kind of like that, right? Where God's not just absolutely wiping their worldview and culture and context of everything they know, but he's taking them on this progressive journey as they're building their relationship, seemingly.
We couldn't bear it. Even the theory about Jesus using parables in the New Testament is because if I use a parable with you, then I'm not confronting you with a yes or no answer yet. I'm allowing you to go home and percolate on the meaning of this. And now you're more prepared to hear maybe more meat. And maybe at this point, after 3 or 4 meetings, I'm going to come up and say, so are you ready? It's time. Are you going to follow me or not? Is what he's saying. And because if I would have started off with that at Jesus, you're probably going to say, no, I can't bear even thinking about it yet. I'm not ready to make such a commitment. And maybe the same thing is going on, at this point, is that if God, think about it, God has not told him anything about being exclusive. Abraham seems to be understanding it better by the end of Genesis 14. But he doesn't have a full picture yet, any more than we have a full picture about our own, personal life, except that, what's our comfort? Knowing that in the end, at the very, very end, everything will be wrapped up, and, everything will be made right, even though it's not right now.
Yeah, we're really slow. It's almost like God's kind of really smart.
And so God doesn't tell Abraham everything he needs to know. He tells him a little bit at a time. He forces Abraham to have faith. And then we come to the threshold of 15, which in many respects is one of the strangest, at least in terms of cultural paraphernalia, it's one of the strangest chapters in the Bible or any ancient literature, in my opinion.
Why does God pick Abraham? That was smooth.
That's a fun question, as long as you don't expect an answer, because to me, it's really no different than Jesus picking his disciples. From a human perspective, and I have to make it clear that I'm talking from a human perspective, it's almost as if Jesus is saying, okay, you and you, and yeah, you over there and you over there. In other words, just sort of random picks. Now, God in his wisdom obviously knows what he's doing, but in this particular case, there's nothing particular about Abraham. We're not told anything about him. Oh, yes, he was a good, righteous man. And that's, of course, why in the Jewish tradition, he's already asking questions. And so he's being prompted for God to, make an appearance. He's already been thinking about the fact that how could you be worshiping, these idols as gods? But there's none of that. And so I would almost prefer that he's a random person that God just sort of picks out of the blue. In other words, I'm God. Whoever I pick, it's irresistible.
His picking has more to do with the goodness of God
rather than
any onus or some type of self-righteousness on Abraham's part.
And think about it.
Not that he couldn't maybe.
But think about the format does not change with someone like Moses. And of course, Moses, in a sense, proves himself by, this sounds bizarre, but he proves himself by defending an Israelite, but he does it in, of course, an improper way by murdering an Egyptian. But the point of that passage, I think, is really to show that he actually is sort of set up because he's a staunch defender. Now he needs to sort of channel his defense outside of anger, but he's showing that he can be used. David the same way. Why does God pick Saul? I mean, these are fun questions as long as you don't expect the real answer, because in a sense, what you're now trying to do is penetrate the mind of God.
It's a nebulous, ambiguous understanding of.
Well, from our standpoint.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Is like, it's not like, right? Because then you can, it's God's foreknowledge, and it's like, well, yeah, some of that, and maybe some like God's sovereignty Himself, also about the righteousness of God, right? Because sometimes it's he picks the least of these to show His own glory and
Yes.
power.
Yes.
So it's like, okay, so then, right? Jesus picks these 12 average dudes. Why? Because He's Jesus. He can.
And it's the last people you would expect.
And so He can. And so, but it's not like, yeah, I think you try to find this line in the sand of where these things meet: God's sovereignty, His foreknowledge. Maybe His God's foresight of their own faith, who they're gonna be, and I think it's all these things piled in, and you can't figure out where it lands.
Is it really any different than God deciding to make dust creatures, and then determining that they will be image bearers? It's like, I'm taking the most insignificant, piece of matter, and I'm going to make it into sons of God. It's like, okay. I mean, and of course, if you look at it from one standpoint, then there would be no mistaking the fact that God did it, through His glory. And so when you take a random person like Abraham, and he becomes, the father of, all those who believe, and, by the way, remember, this guy's a Gentile. He never becomes anything other than a Gentile. He's a Gentile, so he's the father of all peoples who believe. And that's when Paul talks about the branches in Romans 11. There's a Jewish branch and there's a Gentile branch, but the root is the root of faith of Christ, from the seed of Abraham's belief. And so, there's that root down there. And so we're just, the branches. Here's the root down here. And it's God's doing, with this receptacle. And of course, what's Abraham's favor? He gets the entire earth will be blessed through him. I mean, does he even know what that means? And of course, think about it. Nothing has happened for him between 12 and 15. There's been no fruition in the same way that, we think about it. Here I am, we celebrated Easter a few months ago. I'm thinking, what is our hope? Our hope is the great resurrection. But, I have news for you. It hasn't happened yet. And my body at my age is rotting away every day. It's, one more creak, one more, soreness. And thinking, wait a minute, I'm sort of declining. I'm not on an incline, but I'm waiting for, the completion, of my journey, but it hasn't happened yet. So who am I relying on? I'm relying on Hebrews 7:25, the one who is able to save me to the uttermost. He has the power, and he's also, but just as important as his power is his reliability. In other words, he's actually going to do what he said he's going to do, even though it doesn't look like it today.
Yeah. Like any answer or anything you look at, it's, why does God do it? Because of His own righteousness, His own faithfulness, His own loving, or His own love, His own kindness, and ultimately, to make His own name great, His glory. So
for a Sunday school story, if you think about it, the thing to get from Abraham's story is here's God giving Abram a crumb, just start walking, and good things are going to happen, but you just have to start walking. And I'm not telling you anything else. And even if he did tell him more things, the narrator only wants you to know that little pinprick of information. Clearly, Abraham does not understand it very well. And that's really no different than our life. Abraham, all he was asked to do was to follow, meaning to walk and obey and align himself with this God. And at some point, he begins to understand that this God is God.
Similar request from Jesus later on.
Yes.
Follow me.
Yeah.
Oh,
no different.
Well, awesome. Well, if you want to give a very short little teaser into the smoking pot and what's going to be addressed on the next episode, I don't know.
Well,
build the tension and mystery for us.
Well, just a brief thing is now God meets Abraham again now in chapter 15. This is his third theophany, if you want to use that technical term, a manifestation of God in front of Abraham. And God, by the way, even uses a pun that I'll talk about based upon what just happened. But the point is, God's coming to him, and Abraham evidently is lost his patience at some point, because Abraham says, God's saying, I'm going to be your shield and I'm going to do all these things. And Abraham just sort of loses it, like, well, nothing has happened yet. In fact, my life is actually, my situation is worse than it was before. So what's the deal? And that's when God decides to now give him a covenantal promise. But the method in which he gives this promise is so strange. It's some sort of covenant. We can gather that, and there are hints from the ancient Near East as to what you would do with a tree. This looks like a covenantal grant. Moshe Wanfeld made this argument about 50 years ago in a journal of the American Oriental Society, and I think it's pretty much secure at this point. But this seems to be a grant that a superior gives to an inferior based upon services. And what's the service? Probably the service that Abraham did in Genesis 14, and the fact that he also made his own oath to God. And he wasn't asked to, at least in the Genesis narrative. In other words, he was showing himself to be a faithful, loyal Yahweh worshiper. Now that you've done that, now let's go through the process. And so there's a covenant ritual. But man, is this a ritual? You think it's weird in verse 17. How about verse 12? It's dark and it's scary. And then in verse 17, it starts up again. Did I forget to tell you it was dark and scary? It's like, this is, and why are they emphasizing the darkness? I'm going to try to figure that out. And then, of course, you've got these animal parts. Abraham was asked to go get a bunch of animals and cut them up and lay them alongside each other. And we now know through covenant rituals that somebody goes through the parts or for the rituals, although it's never explained to us in Mesopotamian texts and elsewhere. And then all of a sudden, Abraham doesn't go through the parts. He's fast asleep. So this is also something that's done through a dream, oddly enough. And then I get this view. I don't know, as a kid, I remember having to read this thinking, so what went through the parts was like a big Westinghouse oven in a flame. Like, that's about as random as I can think. And of course, if I read 2,000 years worth of commentaries and they all say the same thing, this probably represents God. And my answer is, all right, that's too good to be true. There must be something going on out there. What really is happening? And
don't give it away.
You're going to be shocked, but it led me to Mesopotamia again. And I'm going to tell you what I think is going on, but it's actually going to make it worse for you.
There we go.
In terms of understanding.
That's a good teaser.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, like and subscribe below. Let us know if you have any further questions. We got our email down below as well. Otherwise, join us next episode where we talk in depth about the flaming torch and the smoking pot.
Good.
Nailed it. All right. See you guys.